"Get out of my store, you dirty black woman, before I call the police and have you dragged out like the thief you are." The shout ricochets off the glossy aisles, snapping every head toward the front register. Greg Fulton, the store manager, stands rigid, chest puffed, his voice heavy with contempt. Denise Caldwell, the black woman at the center of it all, stands in the glare of fluorescent lights as the sting of his open palm burns across her cheek. The sharp crack still seems to hang in the air, bouncing off polished tile. A cartwheel screeches to a halt. Somewhere, a child's whimper breaks the silence. A woman in a red scarf draws her little boy closer, eyes darting between the two. A cashier freezes mid-scan, her hand hovering over the register as if afraid to move. Greg's smirk widens, certain he's just put her in her place, certain the crowd will side with him. But Denise doesn't lower her gaze. She straightens, slow, unshaken, and fixes him with eyes like tempered steel. Her silence is more dangerous than any words could be. From the crowd, a faint click. Someone's phone camera is recording. And in that charged stillness, the entire store seems to hold its breath, waiting to see who will move first. Denise Caldwell stood in the fluorescent glare of Caldwell and Moore's flagship store like she'd stepped into enemy territory and already mapped every exit. Her tailored charcoal suit skimmed her frame without a crease, the kind of fit that whispered money to anyone paying attention. Though Greg Fulton, the man who ran this branch like a petty kingdom, wasn't paying attention to details. He was paying attention to her skin. Greg had been the store manager for 8 years, long enough to believe the place couldn't function without him. His reputation among minority customers was a bruise. The company refused to press on. Too many complaints quietly shelved. Too many misunderstandings swept aside. Today, he loomed behind the counter with his arms crossed, assessing Denise like a judge waiting to hand down a sentence. Behind him, Barbara, the older cashier with the paper-thin patience of someone who'd seen far too much, kept her eyes on the register. She knew the drill. When Greg found a target, it was best to disappear into the background. A few feet away, Ethan, the assistant manager barely out of his 20s, shifted his weight from foot to foot, trying too hard to look loyal. His tie was crooked, his expression torn between admiration for Greg's bluster and unease at the way the room had gone tense. Denise moved with the precision of someone who didn't waste gestures. She traced a fingertip along the edge of a glass display, pausing at a handbag whose price tag could make a monthly mortgage blush. Her eyes didn't wander to the security camera overhead, though she could feel it watching. She didn't need to check. She knew the lens would follow her. The store breathed in slow, measured inhales, the hum of the air conditioning, the distant beep of a scanner, the faint shuffle of shoppers keeping their heads down. Denise took her time, not to provoke, but because she refused to be hurried. Every step she took toward the counter sounded sharper than it should have, heels striking polished tile like a metronome, counting down to something inevitable. Greg's gaze never left her, a thin smile curling in the corner of his mouth. "Some people," he muttered to Ethan, just loud enough for the words to slip into the air. Ethan didn't reply, but Denise caught the flicker of his eyes toward her, a mixture of warning and apology he wouldn't dare voice. Barbara rang up a customer with mechanical precision, but her hands moved faster than usual. Denise caught the subtle tension in her shoulders, the way her lips pressed into a line. She wasn't looking directly at Denise, but her body language said she'd seen this scene play out before, with different faces and the same ugly ending. Denise reached the counter and set the handbag down gently, as if she owned the glass beneath it. Greg didn't reach for it. Instead, he leaned forward, both palms flat, his shadow stretching over the register and across the item she'd placed there. Around them, shoppers slowed their pace, drifting just close enough to hear without looking like they were listening. The air carried that electric weight people feel when a confrontation is brewing, but hasn't yet broken. Denise met Greg's eyes without blinking. In that moment, she wasn't a customer, and he wasn't just a manager. They were players on a stage neither had built, but both knew their parts. Greg's role was to provoke, to corner, to control. Hers was still unfolding, but there was an edge to her calm that didn't belong to someone unprepared. And if Greg had been sharper, if he'd been less blinded by the certainty that he ruled this space, he might have noticed it. He might have recognized the look of someone who had already decided how this story would end, and that his role wouldn't survive the final act. Greg's voice cut through the store like the tearing of fabric. I saw you slip something into your bag. Don't lie to me. I've been doing this long enough to know when someone's here to steal. It wasn't just an accusation. It was a performance. He pitched it high, loud enough to reach the furthest aisle, letting it swell so every shopper would hear, and every head would turn. The polished floor seemed to amplify it, carrying the words like a loudspeaker. Denise didn't move. The handbag, deep brown leather, stitching neat as a heartbeat, rested on the counter in plain view. Her own purse was zipped shut, hands still at her sides. The absurdity of his claim didn't matter. This wasn't about theft. This was about the theater of power, and Greg played his role without shame. 2 security guards appeared at the end of the aisle, their dark uniforms parting the customers like a slow-moving tide. One held a radio close to his mouth, murmuring into it, while keeping his eyes on Denise. The other's boots tapped with a steady, deliberate rhythm, a predator's approach in slow motion. The whispers began before the guards even reached her. She stole. I knew it the second she walked in. People like that. Denise heard every word, sharp as glass, but her face didn't shift. Her gaze stayed on Greg, steady and level. She could see the satisfaction blooming in his expression, that smug, oily pleasure that came when he thought he had her cornered. Barbara's hands were trembling now, as she scanned a customer's items. Ethan lingered too close to Greg, eyes darting nervously from the manager to Denise, as if searching for a signal that would tell him which side would win. The guards stopped a few feet away. Greg gestured toward the handbag. Check her. Empty her bag. Let's see what she's hiding. One guard reached out, not to her but toward her purse. Denise's voice, when it came, was quiet enough that the front row of onlookers had to lean forward to catch it. You're making a mistake. Greg laughed. Short, sharp, dismissive. The only mistake would be letting you walk out of here. The first guard's fingers brushed the leather strap of her purse. Denise didn't step back, didn't flinch. The weight of her stillness made the air feel tighter, heavier. Greg, sensing her refusal to beg or protest, raised his voice again. This is why we have a problem in this country. People like you think you can take whatever you want and play the victim when you're caught. The murmur in the crowd deepened, an ugly undercurrent. A mother pulled her teenage daughter closer, whispering something in her ear. Phones were out now, at least 4, recording from different angles. Greg reached for the handbag on the counter, lifted it by its straps, and held it up like evidence in a trial. Do you know how much this costs? More than your rent, I bet. Denise tilted her head slightly, the faintest movement, like she'd just spotted a flaw in a priceless vase. Greg mistook it for shame and pressed on. Security, call the police. She's not leaving until we get an officer here. The first guard nodded, and lifted his radio. The second shifted his stance, blocking the path to the door. Customers near the entrance hesitated, caught between curiosity and the urge to avoid the scene. And then, the slap. Not the half-hearted brush of a hand, but the full sharp crack of skin meeting skin with intention. The sound broke the air clean in two. Even the humming lights seemed to pause. Gasps erupted around them. A child whimpered. The handbag swung slightly in Greg's hand, the motion oddly casual after the violence of the moment. He didn't apologize, didn't even look like he thought he should. Denise's head turned with the impact, but when she straightened again, her expression hadn't cracked. Her cheek flushed deep against her skin, but her eyes were something else entirely. They weren't the eyes of a woman humiliated. They were the eyes of someone making calculations. Greg smirked at the silence. Now maybe you'll cooperate. Denise let her gaze drift over the crowd, meeting no one's eyes, and yet making every person feel she'd looked straight at them. The guards waited for her to crumble. The customers waited for her to break. But instead, she inhaled once, deep, slow, and exhaled with the kind of control that made it feel like the room had just shifted in her favor. Greg didn't notice. He'd already decided the scene was over, that he'd won. He didn't see the way her posture had changed. He didn't hear the quiet note beneath her voice when she finally spoke again. This, she said, is going to cost you more than you can afford. The guards exchanged a glance. Phones kept recording, and somewhere, in the farthest aisle, the faint creak of a stockroom door opening was the only sound that dared to follow her words. Greg's voice climbed again, not out of necessity, but for show, the way a man raises his tone when he knows the crowd is listening. This is exactly the problem. People like her come in here thinking they can take whatever they want, and then cry foul when they're caught. It wasn't a statement, it was a sentence, the kind meant to brand her in the minds of every customer, so they'd walk out believing his version of the truth. Barbara stopped bagging the customer's groceries mid-swipe, her hands hovering. Ethan stood straighter, like he was ready to follow orders before Greg even gave them. And then Greg gave them. Block the doors. I don't care who's leaving. Nobody's getting past until the police arrive. The two security guards split like they'd rehearsed it, one to the sliding doors at the front, the other to the emergency exit by the side. Customers at the threshold shuffled back, unsure whether to argue or obey. The low murmur of voices grew into a constant buzz, like bees disturbed from a hive. Denise stayed exactly where she was. Her breathing was slow, deliberate. She could feel her pulse in her cheek where the slap had landed, but there was no heat in her voice when she finally spoke. I'd like the contact information for the corporate owner. Greg's head snapped back like she'd said something ridiculous. Then he laughed. Not a belly laugh, a short, dry, dismissive chuckle meant to cut her down. You think you're gonna call corporate? Lady, you're not that important. You're just another broke troublemaker who doesn't know when to quit. The crowd reacted to that, some with raised brows, others with the satisfied smirk of people who'd already chosen their side. Phones stayed up, recording lights glowed red. Denise didn't answer him. She didn't need to. Her eyes swept the space, not nervously, but with intent. She noted the positions of the cameras, not just the customers' phones, but the store's own high-mounted domes. She took in the clock above the counter, the way Barbara's lips pressed tighter with every word Greg spat. The way Ethan avoided her gaze now, realizing maybe, just maybe, Greg had gone too far. Greg stepped closer, invading the last inches between them. His cologne was sharp, synthetic, meant to assert presence but only making him smell more manufactured. You think standing there quiet makes you look smart. His voice had that mocking sing-song edge. No, it makes you look guilty. And when the cops come, you'll be wishing you walked out when I told you to. He turned toward Ethan without waiting for an answer. Go pull the footage from the cameras. I want it ready to send to the police. Ethan hesitated. Denise caught it, the fraction of a second where the younger man's loyalty wavered. Greg didn't. He was too busy playing to his audience. That's right, he said, raising his voice again for the shoppers. We keep records here. We keep proof. And she's about to find out exactly how it feels when her little stunt blows up in her face. A teenager by the frozen section whispered to his friend. Man, this is gonna go viral. The friend just nodded, never lowering his phone. Denise shifted her weight, one hand resting lightly on the counter, her face calm enough to seem detached. But inside, her mind was assembling pieces, the security footage, the witnesses, the words Greg had chosen so loudly, and the simple fact that every second he kept her here. He was giving her more to work with. Greg leaned back, satisfied. He believed this scene belonged to him, that the story was already written. He didn't see that the woman in front of him wasn't shrinking, she was sharpening. When she finally spoke again, her tone was even, almost gentle. You really should be careful about what you say in front of a camera. Greg blinked, the first sign of uncertainty since this started, but he recovered quickly, waving her off. Save it. Cameras don't lie. No, she said, they don't. The words hung there, quiet, deliberate, and for the first time, Greg's smirk faltered just a fraction. Not enough for him to recognize danger, but enough for the people watching to feel something shift, like the floor had tilted ever so slightly under his feet. And Denise, she knew exactly how far it would tilt before he fell. Denise's phone vibrated once in her jacket pocket, a quiet pulse against the steady thrum of voices and shuffling feet. She didn't move right away. Let Greg keep talking. Let the crowd keep filming. When she finally slid her hand into the pocket, and drew the phone out. Her movements were slow, deliberate, calculated to look like she was just checking the time. The screen lit up with a name she knew well, Jonathan Pierce, her attorney. The message was short, almost casual, 3 lines that changed everything. Caldwell and Moore corporate papers cleared. Ownership transfer finalized. You hold 72% controlling interest. Call me. She stared at the words, letting them settle in the air between her and Greg like an invisible shield. For months, the acquisition had been a silent game, her identity buried in layers of shell companies and non-disclosure agreements. She had walked into this store today, as an ordinary customer, because she'd wanted truth, unfiltered by corporate spin or staged visits, and now, she had it. Greg was still talking, his voice bouncing off the aisles, building his little stage. You see, folks, this is why we keep people like her in check. If you let one get away with it, the rest will follow. His eyes flicked to the security guard at the door, who nodded back, as if this was standard procedure. Denise locked her phone, and slipped it back into her pocket. Her heartbeat hadn't changed, but her perception of the room had. This was no longer a confrontation she needed to escape from. This was an opportunity. Every word Greg spoke was evidence. Every order he gave was rope he was tying around his own neck. She let him keep talking, offering nothing but silence in return. Silence was dangerous. It made people fill it with their own noise. Greg filled it with boasts, exaggerations, and sharp-edged remarks that carried a stink of something deeper than shoplifting accusations. From her spot at the counter, she began making an invisible list. Point 1. Verbal slurs recorded on multiple devices. Point 2. Physical assault in public view. Point 3. Unlawful detention with blocked exits. Point 4. Targeted racial language that could pierce any HR defense. Each one, stacked neatly in her mind, a case being built brick by brick, while the man who would crumble beneath it smiled at his own performance. A mother near the canned goods section whispered to her teenage son, "She hasn't even raised her voice." The boy shrugged, still filming. "Maybe she's scared." Denise heard it. She let them think that. Fear was an excellent disguise for precision. Greg leaned closer again, his smirk still intact. "Don't think your fancy clothes are gonna save you. I've dealt with your type before. You leave here with a record, not a receipt." She tilted her head just slightly, meeting his eyes with that same calm that had begun to unnerve. "You right about one thing," she said softly. Greg arched an eyebrow. Oh, and what's that?" "This will leave a record." He didn't catch the weight in her voice, didn't hear the certainty of someone speaking from a place far above his imagined authority. He thought she was bluffing, clinging to dignity before the inevitable. What he didn't know, what no one in that store knew, was that the real owner of Caldwell and Moore was standing in front of him, watching him burn his own career to ash in real time, and she had no intention of putting out the fire. She let the moment breathe, the crowd still leaning in, Greg still basking. Inside her mind, the chessboard was already unfolding. The queen was about to move. Denise didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. Her words slid into the air with the calm precision of a scalpel. "I'll need a printed copy of the store policy you just quoted to me." Greg's smirk twitched. "You don't need." "Yes," she interrupted, her tone still even. "I do. I also want the exact name of every employee involved in detaining me, first and last, spelled correctly." A ripple of movement passed through the crowd. Some customers turned toward Barbara, others toward Ethan. Barbara's hands, still on the register, stilled completely. Ethan shifted uncomfortably, glancing toward Greg for guidance. Greg gave a laugh that was meant to sound dismissive, but landed thin. "Lady, this isn't a courtroom. You don't get to make demands." Denise tilted her head. "Then you won't mind me documenting that refusal as well." She produced her phone, but instead of raising it to record him directly, she tapped open the Notes app and began typing slowly, her eyes fixed on him the entire time. The deliberate click of each keystroke seemed louder than the murmur of the crowd. "What are you doing?" Greg asked, his voice hardening. "Writing down the time, the names, and your exact words." He stepped closer. "Oh,
You think that's gonna scare me? No, she said, slipping the phone back into her pocket. I think it's going to protect me. Something flickered in his expression, not fear, not yet, but a flash of awareness that she wasn't playing the part he'd assigned her. He waved to Ethan. Go get her the policy, and make it quick. Ethan hesitated, then nodded and disappeared into the back office. Denise turned her attention to Barbara. Would you please print me a receipt for this transaction, the one you started before your manager intervened? Barbara's eyes darted to Greg, then back to Denise. Slowly she reached for the register. Of course, she said quietly. The thermal paper began to spool out, the soft whir filling the space between them. Greg's jaw tightened. You're wasting everyone's time. You think these people care about your little stunt? Denise's gaze drifted over the crowd. Several customers held their phones lower now, no longer hiding the fact they were recording openly. One older man, near the bread aisle, gave her a single subtle nod, the kind of nod that says I'm with you. She returned her eyes to Greg. I think they care about seeing the truth, and you're giving them plenty of it. The paper crinkled as Barbara tore off the receipt and handed it to Denise. She folded it neatly and slipped it into her jacket pocket like a piece of evidence. Anything else, Your Highness? Greg mocked, but his voice had lost some of its earlier swagger. Yes, she said, her tone now edged with steel. I want to know the full name of your regional manager and the date of your last anti-discrimination training. The crowd's murmur swelled. Greg's face flushed, but he held his ground. You're out of line. Denise smiled faintly, the kind of smile that meant she just placed the next piece on the board. Not yet, but you will be. And for the first time since this began, Greg glanced toward the security cameras like they might not be entirely on his side. Denise let the noise in the store swell until it was a living thing, a restless current of whispers, camera clicks and shuffling feet. Then, she spoke just loud enough to slice through it. Since the manager here insists on making this a public scene, she said, her voice carrying without strain, we'll resolve it publicly. Greg scoffed. You're not resolving anything. You're quiet, she said, not raising her tone but leaving no room for negotiation. The sudden steel in her voice made him blink. She turned toward Ethan, whose unease had been mounting all afternoon. Please call every employee to the front, now. Greg stepped forward. You don't get to. I do, she said, holding his gaze, and you'll see why in a moment. Ethan hesitated, then moved toward the store intercom. A crackle of static, then his voice. All staff to the front registers. Staff meeting. Within minutes, employees emerged from every aisle. Cashiers, stock clerks, a bakery worker still dusted with flour. Customers stayed where they were, forming an unspoken audience. The security guards lingered near the exits, uncertain now if they were blocking the right person. Denise walked to the center of the open space, her heels sharp against the tile. Before we begin, she said, let's make sure everyone's eyes are on the truth. She gestured toward the bank of big screen monitors above the electronics section. Ethan, still pale, moved to the control terminal. With a few keystrokes, the store's security feed filled the screens. Grainy footage showed Greg confronting her, his words audible through the speakers, his accusations, his orders, and then, the slap, slow motion. The sound, sharp and undeniable, cut through the silence like a whip crack. Gasps rippled through the crowd. Someone muttered, "Oh my God." Greg's face drained. "You can't." "I can," Denise interrupted, "because I own every pixel of this footage. I own these cameras, this building, every register, every shelf, every product in it." Her words landed like a hammer on glass. "You what?" Greg's voice was suddenly smaller. "I am Denise Caldwell," she said, her tone steady. "Majority shareholder and controlling owner of Caldwell and More. I've been touring branches unannounced to evaluate staff. Today, you failed, spectacularly." The crowd reacted in waves, shocked laughter, murmurs, the faint hum of phones buzzing, as people texted updates to whoever was on the other end. Greg looked from face to face, searching for someone to back him, finding no one. This isn't, it is. Denise cut in. Your behavior today wasn't just unprofessional, it was discriminatory, abusive, and a liability to this company, which is why, she glanced toward the entrance, I've already contacted HR. Two professionally dressed individuals entered, carrying clipboards and a thin folder. The taller one spoke first. Greg Fulton, you are hereby terminated, effective immediately. Your actions have violated company policy and federal law. The shorter rep slid a document onto the counter. Please sign to acknowledge receipt of your termination notice. Greg's mouth opened, but no sound came out. Cameras caught every second, the way his hands hovered over the paper, the way his shoulders slumped. Denise didn't move closer. She didn't have to. Consider this your final performance, she said, her voice carrying just enough to reach the customers in the back. Because after today, you won't be playing the role of managers anywhere. The crowd erupted, some in applause, others in stunned silence. The videos were already uploading, the comment sections already forming. Greg signed the paper with a trembling hand, the pen clattering against the counter when he dropped it. And Denise, she simply turned away, knowing the real damage had already begun. Greg's walk to the door felt longer than it had any right to be. The same crowd he had puffed himself up for only minutes ago now lined his path, their faces lit by phone screens capturing his fall in real time. Every step was punctuated by the faint whir of recording, the low murmur of disbelief, and the occasional click of a photo being taken. He tried to keep his chin up, but the HR rep's presence at his side, clipboard in hand, turned his defiance into something closer to a shuffle. When the automatic door slid open, the daylight seemed to expose him even more. He glanced back once, not at Denise, but at the store he'd ruled over for years, and then the glass closed behind him. His career didn't just end in that moment, it evaporated. Denise turned to face the customers, her tone shifting from steel to measured warmth. To those of you who had to witness what happened here today, I'm sorry. You deserve better from this store, from this company, and from the people who represent it. She gestured toward Barbara, toward Ethan, toward the staff who had stood quietly in the background. You deserve a place where respect isn't negotiable. Murmurs of agreement moved through the crowd. As a small acknowledgement of your time and patience, she continued, any customer who was present today will receive a store credit, no purchase necessary. She didn't have to add that it was coming from her personally. The way she spoke made that clear. Ethan approached, his face still carrying the weight of what he'd seen. Denise studied him for a moment, then said, you handled yourself better than you realize. Effective immediately, you're the interim store lead. His eyes widened, a flush of surprise replacing the earlier unease. Barbara's lips curved into the faintest smile, a quiet relief settling in her shoulders. Denise didn't linger. She didn't give a grand speech. Instead, she let her last words be a statement carved in stone. This store, every Caldwell and Moore store, operates on zero tolerance for discrimination. That's not a slogan. It's the law of the land. She knew those words would carry. In the videos already climbing the social feeds, they'd be replayed again and again, as much a part of the story as the slap, the confrontation, the reveal. And when she finally stepped into her office upstairs, she did so knowing the real victory wasn't just Greg's downfall. It was the message his fall sent to everyone still standing. If you saw this, if you stood in that store, watching a man in power spit lies, and a woman stand her ground, what would you have done? Would you have stepped forward, your voice cutting through the noise to challenge him? Or would you have stayed where you were, phone in hand, letting the camera capture what your courage would not? It's easy to tell yourself you'd be the one to speak. Easier still to believe. Silence keeps you safe. But here's the truth. Silence is a choice, and every choice leaves a mark.
Justice doesn't just happen in courtrooms or behind corporate doors. It happens in the aisles of a store, in the pause before someone decides to act, in the weight of witnesses who refuse to look away. Power isn't always in the hands of the loudest voice. Sometimes it's in the lens of the quietest observer. So tell me, if this moment played out in front of you, would you have been a bystander or part of the turning point? Drop your thoughts in the comments. Share this story if you believe that dignity isn't negotiable, and that no one, no matter their title, has the right to strip it away. Because every time we talk about it, every time we refuse to let it pass unnoticed, we make it harder for the next Greg to think he can get away with it.